Without Cliff Richard, there wouldn't be the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Cliff is seen as the first British rock star, but his influence was all over the world. In 1965, a worldwide poll said he was the world's best male singer, beating even Elvis Presley. Richard was winning awards and selling millions of records, but suddenly he disappeared from the spotlight. What could have caused this? Some people say the music industry tried to silence him. Others say it's something deeper, raw and crushing. Now we know what it is, and we're going to tell you everything. When Cliff released his first song in 1958, it was absolutely amazing. The song was called Rebellious, but what made it special was that it was British. Cliff didn't try to chase acceptance in America, and it worked out for him because his fans believed he was creating something fresh. The song reached number 2 on the charts and caused what the media called Cliff hysteria. The media had found a new favorite and kept promoting Cliff's song. In the 1980s, radio stations weren't complete until they played his songs. With this, Cliff stayed popular and sold records. But when we get to the 1990s, things got weird. Cliff suddenly found himself struggling to stay popular in the media. There were clear attempts to remove him from discussions about rock and roll. The different documentaries that covered the history of British music talked about the Beatles and Rolling Stones, but conveniently left out his name or that of his backing band. Richard thought it was strange. In 1964, when the Beatles were at their most popular, Cliff still had 6 top 10 hits. Paul McCartney even admitted the reason the Beatles left for Hamburg was because Cliff had almost completely taken over the British market. So Richard wondered why documentaries were trying to erase him from history. But he didn't know that things hadn't even gotten worse yet. Radio stations and media companies began to call Richard's songs old. In 1998, Chris Evans, who was the breakfast show host on Virgin Radio, called Richard's songs out of style and said he would never play any of Richard's songs again. Richard was not going to let anyone walk over him like he was some doormat. So he began to openly complain about the treatment he got from the media. He said he needed support from the media to stay in the spotlight because the airplay he got helped him get promoted and sell songs. However, despite his complaints, nothing changed. Is the media determined to make Richard fail? In 2011, a digital radio station, Absolute Radio 60s, which was dedicated to playing popular music from the 1960s, announced they would not be playing any of Richard's songs. Their reason? They claimed that Richard's songs weren't cool. Their DJ, DJ Pete, claimed that Richard didn't fit with the Beatles, the Stones, the Doors, and the Who. It was Cliff who proved to other rock and roll singers that it was cool to sound British in their songs. He helped British rock and roll singers create their own identities, and this was what he got. Richard defended himself, saying that anyone who didn't acknowledge his impact in British history or claimed his songs weren't cool were only lying to themselves and the public. It wasn't only Richard who defended himself. He got support from people like author and rock music critic Tony Parsons. According to Tony, no true pop music fan wouldn't like Cliff Richard. Sting also defended Richard and called him one of Britain's finest technical and emotional singers. However, the industry didn't like that Richard was getting support and took steps against those who were supporting him. In 2004, DJ Tony Blackburn, who was working at Classic Gold Digital, played Richard's songs on the breakfast show he hosted. Everything seemed fine until the head of programs, Paul Baker, sent an email to Blackburn and reminded him they had a policy that they wouldn't play Richard's songs. Blackburn was shocked, so he went ahead and printed out the email. The next morning, he read out the email live on air to the show's listeners, and then went on to play 2 songs by Richard. After that, Blackburn was suspended. However, despite these defenses, Richard still wasn't getting airplay, and he began to doubt if recording new songs would even matter at all. He pulled back from the spotlight a lot, but hadn't disappeared completely. That was about to change, and love played a part. To Cliff Richard, love was a big deal, and he went after it whenever he could. But life always had other plans for him. Well, not always. Most times, Richard was the one with other plans for himself. Richard's first real relationship was with Australian dancer Delia Wixes. Everything seemed fine between them, and the two had been dating for 18 months. However, Richard faced pressure from both his growing career and his family. His father died in 1961, which greatly affected him. The two of them had gotten really close before Richard's rise. Richard wanted his father to see his career grow, but this was no longer possible. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the only painful loss he would face. With his father's death, the responsibility of taking care of the family fell on him. Richard felt like he had to make a choice between completely focusing on his career so he could provide for his family or manage his career. Provide for his family and being with Delia. Richard believed he couldn't do all three and wrote to Delia that he could not sacrifice his career or his family for her. He did what he believed was the best and broke up with her. Delia was devastated, but at least Richard didn't string her along. He truly believed that Delia was going to find someone who was crazy about her. Could it be that he didn't like her enough? After his breakup with Delia, Richard dated the actress Una Stubbs, but the two didn't last very long. Then he got into a relationship with the dancer Jackie Irving. Looks like Richard has a thing for dancers, doesn't it? Richard found Jackie extremely beautiful, and the two of them were inseparable. To many, it looked like eventually Richard was going to get married, and he thought so too. He even wanted to propose to her, but ultimately their relationship ended and Jackie got married to Adam Faith. Still, Richard continued to pursue romantic relationships with women, despite it being that he was only capable of loving his career. In 1982, he met former French Open tennis champion and Wimbledon semifinalist Sue Barker, and they hit it off. Richard flew to watch her play. And their relationship got the media's attention when the two were later photographed, cuddling and holding hands at Wimbledon. In early 1983, Richard was already thinking of marrying Sue, but later in the year, he changed his mind. It wasn't a strange thing from Richard, and with how his past relationships had gone, it was expected. Richard was already married to the showbiz life of a rock and roller, and everything else was secondary. However, he still continued to date Sue, and they were still together in 1984. Then Richard realized something. He admitted he loved Sue, but didn't love her enough to want to commit the rest of his life to her. Sue must have been hurt. But she and Richard managed to be friends when they broke up. Because of his attitude towards relationships, many people began to question Richard's sexuality. But Richard is very private about his life. Except for that one time he revealed he wasn't really interested in. So people concluded that Richard had to be homosexual, but Richard denied that he was. But people weren't buying it. When he called on the Church of England to accept homosexual marriage, people were confident that he was indeed homosexual. However, according to Richard, he was only just trying to be less judgmental than he was when he was younger. Richard felt people were being unfair to him in their judgment and said if he was homosexual, he wouldn't have girlfriends. Still, people didn't believe him. The entertainment industry at the time blacklisted entertainers who were homosexual, and to preserve their careers, these entertainers entered into fake relationships. Many thought Richard was doing the same thing, but Richard revealed that he wasn't and said even if he got married, people would believe what they wanted to. Richard was really committed to his music and didn't want to enter into a marriage and raise a family he wouldn't be able to fully commit to. However, there was one woman he truly loved, Olivia Newton-John. The two became friends in the 1970s, and they began to work together. Richard fell in love with her, but he didn't act on it, and Olivia got engaged to his bandmate Bruce Welch before later marrying someone else. For years, Richard carried the heartbreak and never really healed. He continued to work with Olivia, and in the 1995 musical, Heathcliff, she played Kathy to his Heathcliff. Richard described her as a soulmate. Every woman he met didn't measure up to Olivia. And when she died in 2022 from breast cancer, Richard was crushed. The one woman he loved more than music died. And because of this, he pulled back from the spotlight so he could mourn her. However, he never also completely disappeared at this point. He soon would, and you'll see what caused it. Richard loved music in a way most musicians don't. He didn't see it as a way to only make money, but as a way of life. Richard loved to dazzle, and so in the early days of his career, after that incredible first single, he was called Britain's answer to Elvis Presley. Richard played his part well and adopted Elvis's flashy style. When he performed, he struck a pose of bad boy rock attitude. He didn't smile or look at the audience or camera. He changed the game for British rock and roll artists, and John Lennon, who had previously criticized British music as being unimportant, greatly respected Richard. This highly respected musician is who the media is working so hard to erase. Did Richard do anything to make the media turn against him? Richard believed the media was trying to remove him from the spotlight because he didn't fit the image of the typical rock star. Unlike most other musicians, Richard proclaimed his religion for everyone and lived a life free from alcohol and women. So without a lifestyle fueled by alcohol and women, Richard was seen as boring. People didn't tie his songs to controversy, which he claimed didn't give radio stations the motivation to play his songs. He slammed the music industry for trying to motivate artists to court controversy so they could sell records. Despite knowing that they could be blacklisted, two journalists rose to defend Richard. One of them, Sam Leith, claimed that Richard didn't live like a typical rock and roller. And because of this, he was viewed as a fake rock and roller. Instead of alcohol, Richard loved fruit, which many people found strange. They couldn't understand why Richard was the way he was, and rather than embrace him, they mocked him. The other journalist, John Rowe, described Richard as the rebel who rebelled against rebellion, and a man who had become opposite to what prevailed as the culture of music. Despite the media turning on him and him not having a family of his own, Richard was never truly alone. He had friends who were always around him. He and Cilla Black were friends, and the two hung out a lot across different countries. Unfortunately, Cilla died in 2015. Apart from Olivia and Cilla, Richard has suffered the death of people that he really cared about and who didn't let him feel alone. Each death made him leave the spotlight to grieve. In 1999, his close friend, the British television presenter Jill Dando, was murdered, and Richard found her death hard to accept. But that wouldn't be the end of his losses. Richard could only watch in horror when the daughter of the Northern Irish broadcaster Gloria Hunniford, Karen Keating, was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a powerful event for him, and he made sure to be present for the family as much as he could. Unfortunately, Karen died in April 2004, and Richard performed his song Mizzou in tribute to her at her funeral. As Richard dealt with these losses, his mother struggled with the loss of her own mind due to Alzheimer's disease. After her diagnosis in 1997, Richard and his sisters had found it difficult to manage their mother's condition. Seeing her forget who she was and who they were crushed them. Because of her diagnosis, Richard, who already had a reputation as a philanthropist, began to donate to the dementia research charity Alzheimer's Research UK. He helped them not only raise funds, but also awareness of the disease. He spoke publicly about his mother's condition and what it took to take care of her. However, despite his best efforts, Richard could only watch when his mother eventually passed away in 2007. All of these events tested Richard, but none tested him as much as what happened next. Richard loved Portugal and had been visiting the country for personal and business reasons since the 60s. He even owned a house there. Richard had a winemaking business in the country, which people found weird because they believed rock stars shouldn't have that kind of business. But Richard wasn't the type to care what people said. His winemaking business, including other investments, earned him the appointment of Commander of the Order of Prince Henry from the country. When he wasn't performing, Richard loved relaxing. In Portugal, and in August 2014, he was enjoying the warmth of the country in his home. When he switched on the TV, he changed the channel to BBC to watch the news, and what he saw stunned him. It was his house back in the United Kingdom. The BBC was doing a live broadcast of a raid on his house based on a claim of a man who said that Richard sexually assaulted him. There were accusations that Cliff had a secret room in the house that he used to assault people, but according to Cliff, the room didn't exist. He was surprised by what he was seeing. The police were trying to avoid a Jimmy Savile situation with Richard, and so were thorough. In 2012, it was revealed that Jimmy had been sexually abusing people all his life, from kids to people as old as 75 years old, with most of his victims being female. Although he had a quirky personality, Jimmy was appreciated for his charitable work, which allowed him to have relationships with the British monarchy and other powerful individuals. Jimmy used his charity and influence to assault people, and the police were sure that Richard was doing the same. Richard returned to the UK and went straight to the police voluntarily for an interview. He denied the allegations. He claimed he had witnesses who could provide an alibi, but the police didn't believe him. People also didn't. Already the media made him look like he didn't belong, and people thought he was homosexual. So, in the eyes of the public, Richard was a weird guy who could do anything he was accused of. The UK police continued their investigation, but didn't find anything that could lead them to arrest him. It looked like what they did was deliberate and that they wanted to completely ruin Richard's reputation to the point that he wouldn't be able to release music without being seen as a sexual abuser. However, Richard had people who supported him. The former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald of Riverglaven QC, criticized the police force for their approach to the case. And BBC caught a lot of heat for their coverage of the search. As it turned out, it was the police who leaked the search to the BBC so they could cover it. Richard couldn't go anywhere without bringing negative attention, and because of this, he canceled his visit to the United States to watch the US Open. Tennis championships. The same reason also made him not want to visit the Canterbury Cathedral. The incident shook Richard. He lost weight, developed shingles, and slipped into depression. Nothing mattered to him any more than to just clear his name, but the police were determined for him not to be able to do that. David Crompton, a chief constable, kept talking to the BBC. However, after seeing that there was nothing on Richard, Crompton publicly apologized to Richard. But that apology didn't do anything for Richard's reputation. Then things got worse. A man called Richard and threatened to spread false stories about him. Richard had two choices. He could pay the man off or fight the man and risk getting false stories about him out to the public. Already he was unpopular and the public would just believe anything against him. Richard was torn, but decided to fight the man and reported him to the police. But despite that arrest, the police doubled down on him. They weren't willing to just admit that they had made a mistake and that the accusations made against Richard were false. So in February 2015, the police declared that the inquiry into the alleged offenses had increased and would be continuing. Richard immediately pleaded his innocence and challenged the allegations. The police still didn't find anything, and review of their actions showed that the police had breached their own protocols. Eventually, on the 16th of June 2016, the police dropped the charges against Richard. Finally, he was free, but he didn't truly feel relief. The police and BBC publicly apologized to him, but this wasn't enough for Richard. He sued them both, got his name cleared, and got a big fat payday from them. Still, was this enough to fix his damaged reputation? This event shook Richard so much that during it, Richard disappeared from the spotlight just so he could recover. After he did, Richard performed some more. But now he has given in to something he can't beat: age. Due to his age, he has completely taken a step back from being in the spotlight rigorously. Will he return anytime soon?